Hello. Wanted to talk to you a little bit about the readings that we did this past week from BAX 2020, Best American Experimental Writing. As you know, we specifically looked at Bridget Brewer's story Little Skin Bag, Devin Defoe's The Lovers, also Alice Sola Kim's 1 Hour Every 7 Years. And I apologize if I'm mispronouncing this author's name, but German Sierra's Ecodysis and Black Dog by Alex Terrell or Terrell. It was interesting to see that each of these stories had at least one of you who said that of the selections, it was your favorite, that you could relate to it the most or what have you. Although kind of the runaway favorite was the story by Alice Sola Kim, 1 Hour Every 7 Years. I concur that is a really engaging piece, and I was really drawn into that one as well. So I certainly get it. I do wonder if its preference by the majority of you has something to do with the fact that it is probably the least experimental in terms of narrative technique as the batch that I had you read, as any of the batch. And particularly the way that Kim develops the main character. It's, as you know, a sci-fi story that plays with time travel. So, she cleverly gives us different versions of the character as they are in different timelines and so on. But by and large, the character is fairly conventional in the way that she develops, the character and the way she uses dialogue and description and so on. And so, I wonder, like I said, if part of our majority preference there has to do with its familiarity. Whereas the other stories that I had you read, kind of by varying degrees, are more or less experimental, and particularly in the way that they use character. In fact, in two of the pieces, in Ecodysis and in The Lovers, which I'm not sure I even mentioned. Yeah, I did. Devin Defoe's The Lovers. There really aren't conventional characters in any regard. And even though they both got at least one vote for people saying that they really liked that story in particular, which is terrific because they are great stories. But I would just note that they are the least conventional, I would say, in terms of the way they develop character. I wanted to talk about my idol, William Gass, what he has to say about character, particularly in his really well regarded collection of essays, Fiction and the Figures of Life, which came out in 1970 and has been talked about ever since in literary circles, particularly. I'm not going to go into that detail now just because I want to get into some other stuff and not make this video too long. But one of the selections in particular in that collection is about characterization. And one of the things that Gass talks about is that, yes, what makes a great story and a great novel memorable, what makes it great, is a character. And that tends to be what we kind of come away with as a reader, and that's what we remember and so forth. But he also goes on to expound upon that, saying that characterization doesn't always have to mean the same thing. And he makes the point, and obviously I'm kind of paraphrasing from memory here, but character is essentially the fixed points in a narrative around which everything else sort of attaches. And so a character doesn't necessarily have to be a person per se. It can be an idea, it can be an object, and so on. And I think in some of these selections, we see that particularly. I think the way that The Lovers plays with characterization, the way that Ecodysis plays with characterization is very sort of non-traditional, and yet there clearly are characters in those narratives as well. All right. But really, what I wanted to get at were some key features of each of these stories, or nearly all of them, I guess, that I wanted you to make sure you were kind of paying attention to beyond this idea of characterization. As you may know, my particular interest in writing and then as a reader is in the use of language. And I think that one of the reasons that all of these stories stand out from obviously the thousands upon thousands of other stories, whether experimental or not, from which the editors might have selected, including the original editors who published these pieces in the first place, plus the editors of this anthology, is their use of language by and large. And so I wanted to just look at some key features of that, and a little light here would be useful. Oh my gosh, that's a big difference. All right, so the story "Little Skin Bag" by Bridget Brewer is a unusual little piece, as many of you noted. The characters are strangely named. Little Skin Bag is the title character of the piece, and it's about a party and some and the main event at the party that is rather disturbing, to put it mildly. But what I wanted to look at in particular is Brewer's use of language, and in particular her use of um, verbs. And what she tends to do, or oftentimes does in this story, is to use verbs in unusual ways, and oftentimes using them in contexts which are very different from the way we normally expect to see and hear those verbs used. So it isn't that the verbs themselves are terribly unusual; it's the context in which she uses them. And we get this from the very, very beginning. I want to read a few examples and then just talk a little bit about, kind of underline a little bit what verb she's using. I think sort of unconventionally. And this is the opening paragraph from Little Skin Bag by Bridget Brewer. She writes, Little Skin Bag stood at the stoop trying to shove the ghost back into her mouth. It was a slippery ghost. It squeaked its tail out of her mouth, picked a piece of spinach from her teeth, yawned. It's that it squeaked its tail out of her mouth I want to draw your attention to. Squeak is normally a sound, and maybe there's some sense of sound here too, but really Brewer's using it more to describe a type of movement. It squeaked its tail out of her mouth, which I think really stands out. Now, notice that in that paragraph, obviously, there are a few sentences, and most of them use verbs in pretty conventional ways, but that sentence not, and that's kind of consistent with the rest of the story. So not every sentence is using an unusual verb or a verb in an unusual context. They're kind of peppered throughout the story, which really makes them stand out. Obviously, it's like anything else. If you do something all the time, even if it's in general unusual, it's going to start to be sort of repetitive in the broader kind of context. So you want to make sure you sort of are selective in the way you do it to make it pop and stand out each time. And then just a few uh, paragraphs later, I want to point out this sentence. Um, the front door wrenched open. Again, not totally bizarre, the use of the word wrench as a verb, but to think of the door coming open in that way is not a typical way of describing the way a door would be opened. The front door wrenched open, she says. Just a few more examples. This is a couple pages into the story. Little Skin Bag looked up and happened to catch Collarbone. It's capital C because again the characters are oddly named in this story. Little Skin Bag looked up and happened to catch Collarbone and Carpet, again capital C, stuffing hands through each other's hair. Again, Little Skin Bag looked up and happened to catch Collarbone and Carpet stuffing hands through each other's hair. Stuffing hands, not combing hands or whatever, stuffing hands through each other's hair. Just an unusual way of describing what's a fairly typical kind of action that people might have. Again, a couple more examples. This is a little racier sentence, but she writes, her areolas seemed as big as twin galaxies, and they bounced through the shroud of space beneath her blouse. So not simply the way that we are viewing them, but giving them this physical property of bouncing, and then even more kind of bizarrely through the shroud of space beneath her blouse. So bounced being used in kind of unusual ways. Just a couple lines below that, or a couple paragraphs. Merry Wife, another oddly named character, Merry Wife cocked her head. Quote, "You knew I would," she said, her words prowling into little skin bags' ears, settling on their haunches inside her head, preparing to pounce. Now, obviously personifying the words, but it's such an unusual and wonderful way of talking about how words may enter someone's ears. Her words prowling into little skin bags' ears makes the words seem particularly dangerous. Here's another one I really like, also referencing Merry Wife. Merry Wife says, "Don't act coy." And then said Merry Wife, her feet screamed through the grass. Her feet screamed through the grass. A really interesting way of describing the movement of her feet, particularly quickly, maybe noisily, etc. Right? A really unusual way of using that verb. Okay, so I guess that's it. Not that there aren't other kinds of examples, but those are the ones I want to kind of call attention to. So, again, referencing back to the master, William Gass, he had a list of sort of a recipe for writing, really effective, writing literature, and one of the line items was just the better word, the better word, the better word, just emphasizing the importance of kind of rethinking, revising, rewriting everything. But is there a better word, a better way of saying something? And by better, obviously that can mean a lot of things, but more interesting, more effective, more memorable. A way that really sort of soaks into the reader's psyche and helps the reader to kind of remember it. So yeah, not just the use of verbs, but using them in sort of unusual context. And of course, by choosing these specific unusual verbs, the writer is also bringing in, Brewer is also bringing in, some other connotations and some other ideas, being much more sort of dynamic in the way that she's telling the tale. All right, so that was one of the things I wanted to point out. Let me come back to that one. I wanted to also say a couple of words about Ecodysis, which, like many of you, I had to look up to know what it meant, but it's a term that comes from the insect world, and it's about shedding a skin or shedding a skeleton to emerge as something new. So we had a little bit of a conversation on the discussion board about why that title seems appropriate to this story by, again, apologies for probably mispronouncing the author's name. I tried to look it up online, but it didn't help much. Germain Sierra. But in this story, which again is very unusual in terms of characterization, in the sense there's sort of a group character and not individual characters per se, but it's by far of the group that we read together this past week, the one that uses language in the most interesting, kind of poetic, artful kinds of ways. So for me, it really stood out because that's something I'm especially interested in. And one of the things that Sierra does in this story is create new words. As some of you may know, one of my interests, besides my devotion to the master, William Gass, is an interest in James Joyce, and I teach a course in Ulysses and the MFA program. For a while now, I've been working on Joyce's final novel, Finnegan's Wake, which, for those of you who are not aware, took Joyce around about 17 years to write. And the reason, or one of the reasons it took him so long to write, was because he basically invented a new language to tell the tale, and a language he called Wake-ese. And the words tend to be, a lot of the words tend to be hybrid words, bringing bits and pieces of various words together, oftentimes from languages other than English. And through these combinations, these new combinations of words, giving them additional, oftentimes ironic kinds of meanings. And so it's very, very complex to get through the text. Like I said, I've been working on it in bits and pieces for a few years now. I actually joined a Finnegan's Wake online reading group a few months ago. So we've been kind of, it's a communal project, which is how people have basically been trying to read the text ever since it came out, because a single person just doesn't have the knowledge and the vocabulary to make sense of it on their own very easily. So it's kind of a group effort. But anyway, one of the things that Joyce does that makes it so challenging, but also so rewarding and so beautiful, is the creation of these new words. And Sierra is doing a lot of that sort of thing in this little story. So I just want to go through and kind of point out some of my favorites, and just talk maybe a little bit about them, but mainly just call your attention to them. So this is from the very first page. He writes, "Do not expect any extraordinary exercise from lazy schizonauts." Schizonauts, maybe, is a better way of saying that. So taking the idea of schizophrenia, split, and then knots. So these people who are sort of traveling, in this realm, but they are, sort of split personalities, sort of frantic, that kind of thing. Again, I don't fully know what it means, but it just brings with it all kinds of interesting connotations. And then if there is a sense of sort of, I don't know, wildness about the phrase schizonauts, the fact they are lazy schizonauts makes it even more interesting, right? This It's a little bit longer, quote I want to read. But just a lot of really interesting things are happening here. And maybe in particular, I'll have you kind of look or listen for, and then I'll point out, obviously, some hyphenated words. So combining of words in kind of unusual ways. I'll pick it up with this sentence. "We're happy in a manic way. Other acquaintances, those amusing, imaginary imagos, feeding nice, polypoid hope houses hyphenated, with the leftovers of parental fear, can't even begin to understand. Are therefore thoughts," that's hyphenated, "are therefore broken shared," hyphenated, "pixelated and fuzzy, stroked and blurred, remixed and licked by the long black tongue of the deep info well." Info well is hyphenated. "Our eyes are wet weapons in a never-ending battalion war." Let me read that again without interrupting myself or Sierra all the time. "Yet we're happy in a manic way. Other acquaintances, those amusing, imaginary imagos, feeding nice, polypoid hope houses with the leftovers of parental fear, can't even begin to understand. Our therefore thoughts are therefore broken shared, pixelated and fuzzy, stroked and blurred, remixed and licked by the long black tongue of the deep info well. Our eyes are wet weapons in a never-ending battalion war." So yeah, just all kinds of stuff happening there. Obviously, I'm kind of drawing your attention particularly to these new words, these new hyphenated words in particular in this section. But just the language in general is just so beautiful. Alliteration and internal rhyming within the sentences and so forth and so on. Just some really interesting references there. The imaginary imagos, that's a term, reference to Lacanian psychology. Um, the last reference there, I had to look this up. Battalion War. That's a reference to the philosopher Georges Bataille, who, from my limited reading and to paraphrase in a very limited kind of way, one of the things that he was interested in was how society sort of had two choices in terms of their material wealth. They could either invest it in just ridiculously luxurious, unnecessary purchases, like billionaires having a space race to see who could, shoot themselves in space most successfully, that kind of thing. Or, if not those ridiculous luxuriances, then into war. So, this idea that you would use your excess wealth as a culture to help people, I suppose, to create social programs to make sure nobody's going hungry, etc. Societies don't tend to make that choice. Instead, they either allow the rich to spend their wealth in these just outrageous ways. I remember reading not too long ago of, I think it was Jeff Bezos also, who bought a new yacht, and it was so big he needed to buy a second sort of support yacht to follow around the first yacht to provide support. I don't know. And then, if not that, then you know, using the money to go to war, and obviously the United States and all the trillions of dollars spent in various wars around the world, pretty much ever since our existence. So that's who Battalion is. Our eyes are wet weapons in a never-ending battalion war. Um, yeah, a couple more examples of that unusual and really fantastic word creation. From near the end of the story, most of the time, some of us lay Asomniac in the broadcasting room, listening to music, watching TV, playing video games, reading books, or nap melting, another hyphenated word, nap melting our flesh into an anamorphic, throbbing slug. But the main word I want to call your attention to, the new word, is Asomniac, A-R-E, I'm sorry, A-W-E, awe, and somniac, obviously playing with the idea of sleeplessness, but creating a new word, sort of sleeplessness born of awe, or maybe an awesome sort of sleeplessness, kind of almost epic kind of sleeplessness. Notice too the reference to the anamorphic throbbing slug. I think that's a Kafka reference to the Metamorphosis, the classic short story about Gregor Samsa, who awakes one morning to discover that he's a huge insect. I think that's the reference. And I think I can validate that among other reasons, because there's definitely a Poe reference earlier in this story, where he says, let me read this as another kind of example of just wonderful language. Um, Among us, you, quantum like, are and are not, part whipped cream, part wolf, just vanished from where we were looking a millisecond ago, gone to temporarily haunt one or another's body, jumping from one thing to thing like data, like an evil spirit, like a light drunk nocturnal moth, like a breathed in cloud of weed smoke dancing from mouth to mouth. Username is Usher for those buried alive under the internet's dust. And that goes on from there with really wonderful stuff. But username is Usher for those buried alive under the internet's dust. Obviously, a reference to the fall of the House of Usher, where Madeline is Madeline Usher is buried alive. So that's another thing I love about this particular story, even though it's very futuristic in many ways. Um, it makes these classic literary references that just really, really enrich the text. So I guess what I would say here is what we might want to look at this story in particular is again just the richness of the language, the use of poetic technique, again alliteration, internal rhyme, repetition, all those kinds of things, but also the invention of words, taking pieces of words and putting them together in unusual ways, hyphenating words that don't normally come together via hyphenation to create these really, really interesting ideas and images and so on. So don't be afraid to experiment with language above everything else, perhaps, in terms of experimental writing or whatever. It can really, really be effective. So just as in the previous example, we were looking at unusual verbs in terms of the context they're being used in. Here we're looking at unusual words in terms of being invented by the author, or at least new ways of putting them together, that kind of thing. And then also, these literary allusions. Now, is everyone going to pick up on those allusions? Probably not. And there may be some in here I didn't pick up on myself. Also, I had to look up who Georges Bataille was to get that reference. But I think that's okay. I think making the reader do a little work is fine, and I think it's okay if not everybody gets every single reference, every single allusion. Some of them are going to slip by a reader, but that doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile to put them in there and be sort of an Easter egg of sorts for the readers in the know. One last thing I want to mention, which isn't specific to just this selection from our set of readings, is you may have noticed that in several of these stories, dialogue is represented in non-traditional ways. I mean, we've kind of gotten used to dialogue being presented between characters in quotation marks, and generally speaking, you kind of ping pong back and forth, paragraph to paragraph to paragraph, as you switch from speaker to speaker to speaker, and so on. And a couple of the stories use dialogue in the pretty conventional ways like that, but others not. In this story, we get little snippets of dialogue, and we're not even quite sure where they come from, but they're italicized. And in another selection, the dialogue is italicized as opposed to in quotation marks. The master, William Gass, almost never used quotation marks at all. His dialogue and his exposition kind of bleed together on the page in terms of there's none of those, eye-catching quotation marks. There's none of the paragraphing necessarily. Well, he did do some of that, and so that's another way that we kind of have to slow down and have to kind of think. Okay, is this dialogue? Is someone saying something, or is this the narrator saying something? And so that's another thing to play around with is dialogue, and how do we represent it on the page? Do we have to have a lot of it? And a couple of these stories show us no, you don't. You can write a really interesting story with either no dialogue or very little dialogue. Again, I think sort of the standard model that we tend to be shown is, the sort of Hemingway, rich in dialogue, and short, snappy, punchy dialogue at that model. And again, that's one way of doing it, but it isn't something you always have to do. And so maybe think about, how do you want to represent dialogue? Do you want to do it in the traditional way, quotation marks and so on? Or you want to try italics? Do you want to try no kind of punctuation to represent dialogue? Joyce, who I mentioned, preferred to have an opening M dash, a long dash to signal dialogue as opposed to quotation marks and so on. So there's no one absolutely set way you have to do it, um, but think about it. Think about how you want to represent dialogue. And then the last point I guess I want to make, I want to go back to Alice Sola Kim's story that everyone liked so much, including myself, 1 hour every 7 years, which we know is kind of riffing on a Ray Bradbury story. But I think one of the cool things about sci-fi and experimental work and so on, is that even though the writer's creating this sort of alternate universe in many ways, or a future universe, or whatever it might be, it still tends to be a commentary on our own time. And I looked up the timing of this story, and I think it must have been written around 2018 or so, based on when it was published. I don't know that for a fact, but just again looking at sort of the chronology of when it was originally published and then when it was adopted here and adopted there. And so this couple of sentences really stood out to me from her story, because to me they seem to apply more to our own time as opposed to some futuristic time where there's time travel and colonization of planets in the solar system and that kind of thing. And this is talking about Margot, the main character, who lives on Venus. And uh, we're told, in her lifetime, Margot has seen the sun and they haven't. They referring to the other kids in her class who are so horrible to her. So let me start again. In her lifetime, Margot has seen the sun and they haven't. Venus kids are strong and mean and easily offended. They know there's a thing they should be getting that they're not getting, and that the next best thing to getting something is no one in the whole world getting it. And I don't know what, Alice Sola Kim was thinking of there, but it sure strikes me to be about the MAGA movement, this sort of anger that unfortunately so many people feel in the U.S. that seems to be rooted at um, they're missing things in their lives, and they strike out at others, and they don't want them to have it either. So even though a lot of people in the MAGA movement could benefit from expanded social programs, nationalized insurance, better education, on and on and on, they are so intent that others who they feel don't deserve all that, people of color, immigrants, etc., people of other marginalized communities, they're so hell bent on people they think who don't deserve that don't get it, that they deny it to themselves as well. So maybe that wasn't what Kim was thinking about consciously, maybe a little unconsciously, but probably consciously. Again, let me read it again. And this time, instead of thinking about Venus kids, think about MAGA kids. In her lifetime, Margot has seen the sun and they haven't. Venus kids are strong and mean and easily offended. They know there's a thing they should be getting that they're not getting, and that the next best thing to getting something is no one in the whole world getting it. So whether that was the author's intent, that was a chord that struck me, and it seemed really familiar to my own experience here on plain old Earth. And even though the writer is writing about this futuristic time period. So that's it. Those are kind of the main things I wanted to call your attention to. Just to kind of recap, and I may even forget some of my own points, but that's okay. This idea of characterization, and the fact that characterization can mean a lot of things, and that you can have a story with unusual characters, you can have a story with virtually no characters, and yet they can be very effective narratives. Unusual uses of words, either in unusual contexts or in just the creation of new words out of pieces of other words, etc. The use of literary allusion, even though people may not get the allusions, they can really enrich the text nevertheless. Think about other ways of representing dialogue. Does it always have to be the traditional quoted lines, paragraph, or can you find some other way of putting it on the page that will make it stand out in a different kind of way, will slow the reader down so they have to pay more attention to it, just sort of in tone, in mood be more consistent or complementary with what you're writing about somehow. So just don't default to the normal ways of writing dialogue. See if there might be some more creative, more interesting ways of doing it. And finally, even though we might be experimenting with narration, we're still writing about the world that we know, either consciously or unconsciously, and that's going to come through the text. All right. So feel free to comment in the announcements section of this thread. Whatever observations you want to. Anything you might agree or disagree with, which is fine. Further examples, etc., etc. But thanks for watching, and we will talk to you later.